Hey everyone, this is Paul. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about the definition of atheism. Now, if there's one comment I probably get all the time, the most popular comment I see is that I'm incorrectly using the definition of atheism to refer to disbelief rather than just a lack of belief. So when I refer to the word atheism, I am referring to atheism to mean a belief that God does not exist, not a lack of belief in the existence of God. And in this video, I'm going to explain why I use this disbelief definition and why so many other philosophers of religion, including many atheists and theists, do as well. Now, if you're new to the channel, I really encourage you to check out some of my other videos first. The reason for this is I tend to find a lot of value and merit in most of the atheistic arguments out there, and especially those by people like Graham Oppy, John Schellenberg, J.L. Mackie. And this is part of why I enjoy engaging with them, because I think they're good arguments. I may disagree with the premise and therefore disagree with the conclusion or have some objections, but that doesn't mean I think this is a bad argument or it doesn't bring up some relevant point that's worth discussing. It is very difficult for me, with that being said, to see any merit to redefining atheism to be a lack of belief rather than belief that God does not exist. And as we're going to hear later, there are many philosophers, whether atheistic or theistic, who find this redefinition to be more a result of cowardice than anything else. Now, you certainly don't have to care, but why do I care? Well, believe it or not, I really do care about having good conversations. And there are these groups on Facebook that are titled things like Atheists Don't Think or Atheists Posting Their L's Online. And unfortunately, it only fuels these groups when atheists are inconsistent about their own definition. Now, you don't really have to care what I think, but I mean, if you're watching this video, you probably care a little bit. And if you leave a comment, it's clear you at least care enough to leave a comment. So it is clear that you care. But perhaps the reason you should care is there are people who believe that the inability to have a consistent definition actually illustrates the rationality of the position. It's not, a logical sort of argument, but some people are dismissive of certain positions because they believe that people are using words in a misleading way or they can't get their facts straight. With the idea being, right, if atheists can't get their facts straight about the definition or how they define themselves, how can someone expect them to offer a cohesive alternative to theism? Now, I'm not defending these groups for posting this sort of stuff or making these arguments. In fact, I find it unhelpful. I'm really not a fan of this. But to be honest, what can I say to them, right? In many cases, their observations are correct. When atheists post things like, atheism is the position that there are no effing gods, and then other atheists go and say, oh no, atheism is a lack of belief, it gets confusing to people, and there's sort of an element that these people have that, and I understand, right? Get your story straight. What do we mean by this? So let's define a few things first. Now, theism is a belief in the proposition that God exists. And unfortunately, and perhaps somewhat confusingly, there can be two definitions of atheism, and this depends on where you put the knot. If theism is a belief in the proposition that God exists, is atheism not belief in the proposition God exists, or is it belief in the proposition that God does not exist? Now, I think the good thing about the fact that there is some controversy around this definition shows that there is a difference between disbelief and unbelief. This is a distinction made by V.W. Quine and, of course, Marcel Truzzi also called attention to this as well. Now, what Truzzi said in Web of Belief is, when you disbelieve something, when you say, I disbelieve in God, this is logically equivalent to saying, I believe God does not exist. Whereas unbelief is simply sort of refraining from making a judgment. And it's actually a claim to ignorance, not a claim to knowledge, right? I lack belief, or I lack positive belief in the existence of God. The thing that gets to be difficult here is notice how there's already a word that refers to a lack of active belief in God. This is agnosticism, which was coined by T.H. Huxley. Agnosticism is a word that refers to a lack of belief or unbelief, not necessarily disbelief. Now, with that being said, right, some people argue that anti-theism should refer to disbelief. And I do see this point, right? I do understand, right? Well, perhaps anti-theism is believing that God does not exist. The problem is anti-theism is already overloaded to refer to somebody who is against belief in God from a more moral sort of standpoint. So like the word anti-racist or anti-science, people who oppose it rather than people who simply believe in the not part of it or have, negative belief. And that's why this gets to be difficult. So that's why I personally would rather anti-theism, like some other atheists out there, refer to people who are against belief in God from maybe a more moral standpoint. That's how I use the term anti-theism. Now, Paul Draper writes, This disbelief definition, believing that God does not exist, is, quote, preferred over other senses, including the psychological or unbelief sense, not just by theistic philosophers, but by many, though not all, atheists in philosophy as well. Now, does the fact that the Stanford Encyclopedia article on atheism, which says that atheism is more commonly disbelief than unbelief, mean anything to me? Yeah, actually, it really does. I would trust the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is a peer-reviewed resource, more than random people on YouTube commenting. Now, that's not to say people may not have a good point. It's just I have not found any compelling reason to shift my definition of this word from what professional philosophers of religion are saying to what other people are saying. And given that, right, what about Rowe, Oppie, Schellenberg, Begini, Poitevin? These are all atheists who, in my view, have the best arguments against the existence of God. And, many people on my channel are recommending, and I think they're right to recommend these. These guys are great, right? These all prefer the disbelief definition. Paul Draper says it like this: it is a, quote, fact that atheism is standardly defined in philosophy as the proposition that God does not exist, end quote. So part of me uses this definition out of respect for those I think offer the best arguments against the existence of God. These are the experts in the field, and they use these definitions. And, part of me wants to say, look, if you have a problem with me using their definition, you should also be objecting to them, because this is part of the reason I use this. I'll explain the reason why they use this in a minute, but keep in mind, this is part of why it looks a little odd when I go on a video with Graham Oppie and people aren't commenting, wait a minute, atheism is just a lack of belief. There's nothing to defend or anything like this. Perhaps those people on my comments should be watching their videos and objecting to them as well. Now, let's answer the question, why do most philosophers, and in particular philosophers of religion, prefer this disbelief rather than unbelief definition? Well, the reason here is we're interested more in the truth or falsity of the proposition God exists. And if you're following Western logic, you have the law of the excluded middle, which means this proposition is either true or false. There's no in between. It's either God exists or God does not exist. If we're using the unbelief definition, or we change the definition to refer to something about lacking belief, this shifts the focus from talking about the truth of a proposition to the psychological state of the believer or unbeliever. And the reason this is potentially wrong is, quite frankly, in a context of a discussion about the existence of God, nobody really cares what your or my psychological state is. We want to know whether or not God exists. This is partially why there are some theists out there who do believe God exists, spend time debunking other arguments that theists put forward, while some other atheists will spend time defending these arguments, because who cares what people believe in the context of an argument about the existence of God? We want to know whether God exists, right? We care about the facts regarding God's existence, not one's subjective feelings or beliefs on the matter. Let me put it this way, right? When we talk about rationality, the rationality of theism is directly related to whether the proposition God exists is true. I don't know if the single theist who believes that theism would be rational if the proposition God exists was false. In fact, there was one. I would really strongly challenge them on this particular point. However, if God does not exist, then disbelief in God would be irrational, or at least perhaps at odds with objective reality. Now, the lack of belief is kind of like referring or like keeping from making a judgment per se. The question we should perhaps ask is, why does the rationality of atheism depend on equivocating the definition of atheism? And the reason this is an interesting question is what it looks like to many, and to many atheists who I've talked to, Michael Huemer comes to mind. It looks like people are changing this definition to avoid shouldering a burden of proof or having to defend a claim at all. And this is what happens is it causes some atheists, agnostic, and theists to question whether those who are using this unbelief rather than disbelief definition care about truth at all, as opposed to the sort of aesthetic of looking smart. If you don't want to have to put up anything or stake a claim, you're never having to really defend anything. And in the words of atheist in the sense of disbelief, Michael Huemer, this is, quote, dialectically pathetic. It's the fallacy of equivocation to change definitions to avoid needing to shoulder a burden of proof or to avoid needing to support a proposition. And I think this is why so many professional philosophers are so skeptical of this changing definition, or perhaps the idea of atheism not needing to have a burden of proof. Now, one of the people I think who was involved at least in part of this was Antony Flew, who had his presumption of atheism. It's very interesting that he's also changed his mind on a lot of these things. You can read his book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Very interesting book, very much worth a read. Quite interesting, but he even said, yeah, I've changed a lot of my own views on the matter there, but he's like, basically like, I'm too old to go back and rewrite all this stuff, so somebody else will have to take a look at it. So kind of an interesting claim there as well. And to show why I think why humor and other people find this to be, pathetic, and this isn't meant to be insulting. I mean, maybe they mean it to be insulting, but I don't mean it to be insulting. Suppose I redefined theism to avoid the burden of proof. I could redefine theism as a lack of belief in the proposition that God does not exist. Now, this would mean if somebody wanted to argue that theism is irrational, one would first have to prove that God does not exist. Now, I hope you would agree with me that this move would be pretty pathetic, right? Who cares where the belief part is? We want to know whether God exists or not. I mean, I'd certainly want to know if there are problems that, believing in God led to all these contradictions. I would want to know this. I care less about, then I would change my belief about it. Perhaps I would put it that way. The other thing about this is it would mean that an agnostic would technically be both a theist and an atheist according to both definitions. So if theism is a lack of belief in the proposition that God does not exist, and atheism is a lack of belief in the proposition that God does exist, these are sort of symmetric definitions. Whereas if theism is belief in the proposition that God exists, then atheism, the symmetric version of theism, that would be the sort of other side of it, would be belief in the proposition that God does not exist, and the sort of undecided claim to ignorance would be I don't know whether God exists or God does not exist. It's weird to say I lack belief in the proposition that God exists, but I have positive belief in the proposition that God does not exist. Because of the law of the excluded middle, it's either one or the other. I think part of the other problem here too is many of the new atheists, at least in particular, have reasons that if they believe them would lead them to active disbelief and not just unbelief. And I think this is where this can be a fallacious equivocation as well, because it's misleading to suggest that somebody simply lacks positive belief when they're supporting or providing or believe reasons that would give them reasons for disbelief. So consider some of the new atheist rhetoric that calls belief in God a delusion, that the existence of God is, quote, disproven by science, a failed hypothesis, or an accidental byproduct of evolution. If these things were true, or perhaps the unbelief atheist in question actually believed these things, they would actually have reasons for disbelief in God, not just unbelief, or at least disbelief in the type of personal God we're talking about when we typically talk about theism. So what it looks like to many is they're going to ask the question, why don't these atheists stick to their story? If they really found these sort of arguments compelling, like those from Dennett or Dawkins or these other people, and believe them, they should actively disbelieve the existence of God, not simply reserve judgment. These are arguments that claim certain things about God to knowledge. They claim that God is a failed hypothesis, that belief in God is a cognitive accident. If those things are true, then I would argue this gives us active reasons potentially for disbelief, or at least disbelief in the type of personal God that is assumed to have produced these types of religious experiences in questions. Now, once again, I have no idea why there's not a consistency sticking to this story, but it does suggest that, once again, many of the new atheists care more about looking smart than finding truth. There's a further problem with this unbelief definition. With the existence of some things, like, say, UFOs and other sort of paranormal stuff, I lack belief. This means I have unbelief. I'm claiming ignorance. I don't know whether these things are true or not. But there are still other things I actively disbelieve, things that I believe are actually false, like flat earth theory or the idea that the moon landing was a hoax, these sorts of ideas. And my guess is most unbelief atheists are like this as well. There are some things they reserve judgment on, perhaps like God, and some things they actively disbelieve. The question we should ask is, why does the unbelief atheist spend so much time and energy arguing against something that they simply lack belief in, rather than the stuff that they actively disbelieve in? And, one could argue, why the clubs, conventions, tattoos, fedoras, books, all of this other stuff. Some of the disbelief atheists I've talked to actually say, hey, look, this looks pathetic. This is people making part of their identity, not their belief at all, but in their lack of belief. One person, mentioned, some of these people have conviction about something that they have no conviction in at all, which is kind of funny. I guess it's just kind of ironic. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's okay to have conviction in your own ignorance about something. And I think this is actually can be a very helpful thing to say, I am pretty sure that I don't know the answer to this problem. You're kind of evaluating your own confidence in your own beliefs, a sort of metacognitive step. This is a very helpful thing, and cognitive science suggests that this is actually a good part of learning itself. But what is odd is that these entire conventions are out of claims to ignorance rather than claims to knowledge, which just kind of, perhaps it just looks strange. Like I said, I don't really know if there's necessarily anything wrong with it per se. It just is odd that there are groups that are bounded together by their ignorance as opposed to by any particular claims or needing to defend any particular claims. So let me go through a few possible objections and some answers that I would provide. Now, one potential argument is that theists can't get their facts straight either. Now, let's put aside the fact that this would be a Tukokei fallacy, and I would say, actually, I think this is a fair observation, in the sense that, theists have different definitions of God, and it does seem, at least I could understand why somebody would say, theists aren't always the most consistent about God. However, keep in mind, theists at least agree that God exists, and monotheists in general tend to agree that an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being exists. I'm going to call it the triple O. Now, there are dissenting voices, but they tend to be few and far between. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to sweep that under the rug or brush that aside. There are dissenting voices, but I think the vast majority of monotheists tend to at least have some consistent definition of what we mean when we talk about God. Now, it's true that there are some things about God that people disagree on. One of them that comes to mind is whether God exists outside of time, while others think God is bound by time. Now, I would argue this is a smaller detail. Now, it's still a big detail, in who God is, but it's not really related to the definition of theism itself. And the reason I say this is because my guess is if most theists learned that who thought that God existed outside of time came to learn or believe that God existed within time, they would not say that their conception of God had really changed all that much. Nor would they necessarily say those who think otherwise, whether God is outside of time or bound by time, are not true theists in a particular way. I think perhaps a good argument could be made for either one. And a lot of the stuff I've read about the relationship between God and time tends to argue for almost a dual definition. God creates time and then logically enters into it to become a part of it. An interesting way that this is discussed in the literature. Another claim I sometimes hear is that I'm an atheist with respect to other gods. And I would say that's true. Not only do I lack belief, but I actively disbelieve that other gods exist, something like Zeus. And I would say, but I don't really see what the point is, or at least what the point is with this as well. If by God we mean the triple O creator of the universe, then following Anselm, these other things that we refer to using the word God, like Zeus, would hardly be God at all. It's not omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, the creator of everything, nor really a necessary being with this sort of aseity in mind. The last objection I could possibly hear, and I think this is a fair point, right? Does this really matter? Why care so much about definitions? Well, I think definitions are pretty important and they help us be clear. And this is me coming from definitely an analytic background. Because when we're having a conversation, we want to make sure our language refers to the same thing. Now, I'm not here really trying to argue that other people should necessarily adopt my definition of the word. To be honest, I don't want to say I don't really care, but I'm trying to give a reason why me and so many of the other philosophers of religion use atheism as a disbelief to, once again, show that the focus should be less on the actual definition itself and more on the proposition of whether or not God exists. Hopefully these aren't things that really depend on a definition. Now, perhaps I could hear an argument that we want atheism to refer to a lack of belief, and then we could invent some other word like schmatheism or something to refer to active disbelief in God. And if, there are enough people that would know that that's what that word refers to, then I'm totally fine using that word. I don't care about switching my own definition. I care about trying to be clear and trying to be straightforward. And I think some of the people that are arguing for this unbelief definition are actively trying to be unclear, which is why I think it's why I guess I'm trying to defend this usage in the literature as well. So in conclusion, right, I'm going to continue using this metaphysical definition, this disbelief definition. If scholarly consensus changes, we have a better word to describe it in the future for clarity, like some new word that's being invented, or I have some good reason to have atheism refer to unbelief rather than disbelief, yeah, I'll totally change my usage of the word. So if you do think the definition of atheism should change to a lack of belief, let me know in the comments and why. I mean, like I said, I am open to changing my view on this. I'd be curious to know what those reasons were. Definitely check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on atheism and understand why many people do tend to prefer this metaphysical definition, at least when we're talking about the existence of God and these other sorts of things. But let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.